Hey guys, so as usual, I wanted to provide a tier list of the best hand traps and staples using Dueling Book data as well as data from YCS topping information in terms of, which cards were played in the topping deck lists that were available. So my tier lists tend to essentially reflect, based on the representation of how often these cards were actually played. So for example, just because one card is tiered higher than another card does not necessarily mean that it's, quote unquote better. It's just more so that, let's say, for example, maybe some players just were not as aware of these cards and that's why it wasn't played as much, or let's say only certain decks can play it. So you do have to be aware of those nuances as well when it comes to these kind of tier lists and best hand traps and staples, and that's why I actually highly recommend that you check out Jesse Cotton's recent tier list video. Very insightful, and it will also provide a really good full picture. So as usual, definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Sleeves. For example, Dragon Shield, you can use code Hakuna5 for 5% off. And also, of course, there's a lot of Black Friday sales going on with like Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles, so you can also use code Hakuna5 at Tier 0 Games and Card Brawlers for those Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles in terms of rarity set reprints or maybe even Valiant Smashers. Anyways, let's just get to the tier list for this month, and we are going to start with Droll and Lockport. So if you watch my recent YCS Top Cut breakdown video in terms of Richmond, Droll and Nibiru were actually the most played hand traps for that event, and so it is certainly very strong. It is kind of interesting though, because against certain decks, of course, it's not actually that good. Let's say, for example, against Unchained, which is still a very strong tier 1 deck, Droll, for the most part, it doesn't do that much. Also, of course, against like Labyrinth, it's also not going to really be that impactful. But against certain other strategies, of course, let's say Vanadium is always like a key example, but a lot of like, let's say even like Rescue Ace tier elements, Droll can be very good against them as well. So it is certainly I think deserving of its kind of high tier status. Nibiru, again, as I mentioned, was also actually tied for first in terms of most played at YCS Richmond. Again, this is a card that can be really impactful against a lot of decks, let's say like Unchained, let's say Rescue Ace, even something like, tier elements can potentially, if they're not on Rocalis, for example, which I think for the most part they're not on King of the Swamp package anymore. Nibiru can also be pretty good against, of course, something like, let's say, Pearly or even like Labyrinth. Really not that great either. They can sometimes play into it, funnily enough, both of them can, but for the most part, obviously, you're not really siding this against them anyways. We also have Feather Duster here. This is kind of like a prime example of, it's more so that it's just played in a lot of different lists, right? Like 80% of the topping list played it, just because there's no drawbacks to it. It's not necessarily all that insane in the format, of course. Like, for example, let's say even like Labyrinth, where it is a quote-unquote trap deck, but lately, if you see those topping deck lists, they're playing just like a lot of furnitures, and they're not actually on that many traps, especially not floodgates, so they have a lot of chainable traps anyways under something like Feather Duster. So just things to keep in mind. Obviously, Rescue Ace, they do set 4, but at the same time, you still, for the most part, probably have to go through that, the Save Worm spell trap negate that they play. You also have Ash Blossom. Again, this is actually one of the rare times where Ash was not the most played hand trap in this event. Typically it really is, but it's still played in 3/4 of the list. It's not necessarily like a guaranteed card to play, but you are probably going to see in most people's lists. Again, something like Labyrinth, this is very devastating against any branded builds. Obviously, it's going to be very good, but realistically, branded has fallen off quite a bit. Against Unchained, honestly, at certain times can actually be really good, depending on their hand as well. So it is pretty generic, but I think still deserving of its kind of like A spot, just because of how widespread it can be played. And then lastly, we do have Imperm, again, another card that's been seeing a lot of play lately, along with Valor and Ghost Warner, just because Turbulence set 4 is very strong, so you want to be able to try to stop that. Against Unchained, I guess, Tour Guide, or maybe you save it for Caesar if that's like a really problematic card for your particular deck. Against tier limits, I guess it doesn't come up that much. I don't know, maybe like a Divine or Normal Summon. Against Pearly, it can actually be great as well, and I do think Centurion, which is the newest kind of archetype coming out of Valiant Smashers, while I don't actually know what tier it's going to be in moving forward, I'm sure we'll see that very soon at the YCS in Italy. Imperm can be very good against that strategy as well, so just things to keep in mind in terms of your deck list. Moving on to the next tier, we do have Talents. Obviously, it's a really strong card. It's not actually like a guaranteed in every list, though. As you can see, just under half of the topping deck lists, at least among those that were publicly available, were playing it. But nonetheless, if you do play it, it can be very strong, whether going first or second. And so just provides a lot of versatility there, and really strong. Goes along with Thrust usually. We then have Valor. We kind of briefly talked about this in terms of Imperm, and as well as Ghost Mourner, just on Turbulence for the most part, just being really strong. Of course, you do play into Talents, but that is one downside. But, you know, against something like, let's say, like Pearly, they're also a deck that's going to play Valor, just because they do tend to draw on the opponent's turn, and in that instance, you know, Valor would be better than Imperm in those situations, because you're already going to control a card. It being a tuner, I don't know if it really comes up anymore. Like back in the days with Hockey Fibrax, Celine Access Code Turbo definitely really came up a lot, but not nearly as much nowadays. We also have Thrust, of course, kind of goes hand in hand with Talents. If you're playing Talents, you're probably playing Thrust as well, and just being able to set, like, really blow out cards post side, but also just going second, let's say like Evenly, Lightning Storm, those are always nice. Maybe your deck actually plays like an in-engine, like Insane, Spell, or Trap card, right? Like Branded Fusion is a key example, so Talents, or rather, sorry, Thrust, can go really hard as well. And then speaking of some blowouts, Lightning Storm, again, similar to like Feather Duster, you know, you might as well have it. You do see it in a good amount of lists. Again, like let's say with Labyrinth, it's not really all that trap heavy anymore, and against Rescue Ace, I mean, can be good if you can get through that initial spell, Trap Negate, for example, so can come up. Shifter, this is another prime example where technically, if your deck can play it, it is probably like the best hand trap in the game. Pretty much for the most format that this card has been around, it has been, but nonetheless, you know, obviously most decks cannot actually play it. That's why it's never scored anything higher than like tier B in my tier list. But you do see some decks that are not playing optimally under Shifter, but still play, let's say like Rescue and Pearly are key examples. Obviously, realistically, Flunder is the only true deck that's going to be able to play under this really well, and of course now that Cashier is gone, but you know, you also have Exorcister that can play this as well, which actually topped the YCS as well. Now we have Evenly Matched, this still in the B tier, still a good card, not seeing nearly as much play as it was before, you know, but just under 30% of those topping lists in the most recent YCS played it. I do think this partly has to do with like the rise of SP post Age of Overlord, because they can just banish their SP and another monster they control, and they just come back in the end phase anyways, so they don't lose nearly as much. But you know, banishing face down is still pretty unique, and is something that can be impactful, and of course still deserving of seeing some play. Call by the Grave does see pretty decent amount of play, I guess. I mean, 29%, maybe not so much. It's certainly not back in the days of, let's say, like DP, where it was, aside from just like protecting yourself from hand traps, being able to stop something like DP was really critical. So we're not really in that kind of situation anymore, I don't think, in terms of, you know, trying to negate like monster effects in the grave that are that relevant. So Call by the Grave isn't as scored as high, but definitely some decks like, let's say, Vanadium and Droll, or Branded and Ash, like you do kind of need Call by for those decks. And then we also have Fenrir, of course, very generic. Really seeing a decent amount of play in various deck lists. Pretty much most decks can play this, aside from something like Flunder, for example. And so can serve as an interruption going first, or even as a board breaker going second. So it's really flexible, and definitely on the hot seat for that ban list hit. Xyz Encore and Herald of the Abyss, unfortunately, it seems like YGO cannot actually identify these cards rather, so I couldn't actually get proper data for them aside from what was actually, you know, available from like the YCS topping list, and you know, a good 20-24% of the topping deck list were playing either of these cards, just because, you know, Xyz Encore, like for the most part, obviously against something like Pearly X Pearly Noir, can be very hard to out for a lot of decks, so this can be very good. Xyz Encore in particular can, I guess, be also useful against something like Abyss Dweller if you are a deck that really succumbs to them, let's say something like Tier Limits, for example. And then on to the next tier, we do also have Bestials. The kind of like the data for this one, I'm actually basing just on Druid's Worm, but realistically, Magnet is kind of like hand in hand in there as well. I just wanted to be able to fit a little bit more cards on this tier list this time around, but Bestials still good, obviously against, you know, you have Tier Limits and Unchained still kind of high up there, and they're going to be great against those strategies, but at the same time, kind of like along the lines of, you know, Droll, Nibiru, like you're obviously going to have decks where Bestials are not going to be very good at all, like let's say against Pearly, it's not going to do anything. Against Rescues, for the most part, it's not really going to come up, right? I guess like this Save Worm's like a dark, or maybe if they go into the Borload Savage line, which I don't think most are doing anyways, but if they were to, you could get rid of the Link Karibo, I guess. But for the most part, you know, it's like hit and miss against certain strategies. Against Lambeth, though, it's definitely great as well. So, you know what? I think that's why maybe it's not so high this time around. But similar to Bestials, we also have DD Crow. This card's also useful. At least for this one, it can actually be useful against Pearly, because you can always get rid of like the quick play spell that they're trying to seize into. And so anything that banishes, like let's say especially against, again, like Labyrinth. You know, for them, like if any card gets banished, like they don't really have an in-engine way to get things back anymore, so those cards can certainly be useful. And DD Crow is also a little more flexible because it can banish any card, and it's also just a quick effect, whereas Bestials, they do rely on your opponent having a monster to become quick effects. We also have Solemn Judgment just as like a going first side option. I do think this card has seen a bit more uptick in play in terms of YCS level events compared to like the last couple of years that I've been doing the breakdown. It's not seeing in a huge amount of lists, but definitely some, and especially, you know, it just provides another Omni Negate for decks that may not actually have one in engine. So next we do have Dimensional Barrier, unfortunately. Now at the same time, the topping deck list for Labyrinth, they actually did not play, or rather they did not main deck D-Barrier, at least among the lists that were available publicly, you know, because it can be bad against some of the other top strategies, right? Like against like Rescue Ace, for example, not great. And also, of course, you know, again, something like Pearly though, calling Xyz or any kind of branded builds, you know, calling, let's say Fusion, and then I guess you have, you know, Vanadium, and now the new Centurion calling Synchro. I'm sure there's applications for that. But at the same time, not really like a guarantee main deck play anymore. At the same time, I hope this card does get kind of hit on or addressed on the ban list, especially with, I believe, Transaction Rollback or whatever it's called, that's coming out early next year. You know, can only make Labyrinth better, and hopefully we do address some of the really problematic trap cards. And then we have Super Poly. This is another card that if your deck can play it, it would be quite good, or at least can be very good. Technically, I guess most decks can play it. It's just more so that they probably won't, because you do have to invest in at least 2 extra deck spots, probably ideally 3 if you're going to make it worth it to play Super Poly, right? I mean, aside from like kind of like your typical targets like Garura, Mud Dragon, and even Dragostapelia, you have some of the newer tech targets like, let's say, Guilty Gear Feed for like the warriors with different attributes, let's say like Barone and SP, or even like, let's say, Draco Exquisite, which is something like, let's say, Barone and like a Borload Savage or Dissipator that you can get rid of. So Super Poly, certainly have seen it in, let's say, like Rescue Ace lists as well. Against Rescue Ace, this can be actually quite good. Against tier limits, it's kind of like hit or miss, I find, especially if they have like Rukalis, and it doesn't really do too much. Against something like Pearly, it's honestly very bad. Against Labyrinth though, it's really good because you can go into Garura pretty easily against them. So it can be hit or miss, but when it's good, it's really good. And you know what? You cannot respond against it, so it can be very devastating. We also have Enemy Controller, which kind of saw a lot of play at the beginning stages of when Cashier became kind of meta. Now we are seeing this again. I think with like Rescue Ace Mirrors, for example, I can only assume it can be quite good, taking like your opponent's Hydrant. It's also a new OTS ulti. Maybe that partly has to do with some of the increased play in the topping deck list. I mean, I'm not actually sure about that one, but nonetheless, it definitely has some applications. The attack or the position change effect probably doesn't come up. I think the only time it can come up, let's say, for example, would be like, let's say, change the Baguska to the attack mode so that you can actually activate effects. So, I mean, I guess those are some applications there. You also have Lava Golem. Again, this is another example of, you know, if you can play it, it's really good. But the problem is most decks probably can't play this because this does burn up your normal summon. But otherwise, you can get rid of 2 monsters for free, especially something like Experling Noir. At least you can get rid of that easily. And also, it kind of burns in time, which maybe potentially comes up as well. We have Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon. This one we haven't talked about that much, but it is definitely a very popular thrust target, especially for, you know, being more flexible than, let's say, something like D-Barrier or Eradicator, which might not really hit certain decks, right? But at least Destructive Daruma Cannon probably is useful against most decks. Obviously, it was better when Kashira was tier 1 because it was really good against them, and that deck is kind of gone now. But you know what? It is still seeing some play. 40% of the topping deck lists were playing, and definitely something to keep an eye out for. And we mentioned this earlier with Effect Veil and Imperm. You do also have Ghost Mourner, which of course can also be served as like a monster negation to try to, let's say, stop that turbulence from being able to set 4. It is a level 3 and also tuner, so I guess there's some applications that can come up with this as well in terms of maybe, let's say, I don't know, going into some kind of synchro strategy. But nonetheless, I think it is something that you're going to see a lot of this in Veil and Imperm. Moving on to the final tier, Forbidden Droplet. I was kind of surprised that this card has seen a decline in play lately, just because when Arise Heart first got banned, of course, a lot of people were saying, oh, okay, well, Droplet's gonna come back in the format now, and it is good, of course, but, you know, not that many topping deck lists were actually playing this card. Of course, this is definitely good in decks that can actually benefit, or let's say, off of discards, or at the very least, let's say, has a way to get a lot of the cards from their grave back onto the field or hand, for example, so that you don't really neck too much on the cost, but nonetheless, I think it still has some application, or a lot of application actually in this format, but it looks like it's not seeing that much play. And you can also say the same thing with Dark Ruler. This has definitely seen a lot of decline in play the last few months as well. We're not in like, you know, let's say like Sprite format where this was like a guaranteed, like essentially main deck card at that point. We're not in those stages anymore. I mean, this card is going to come back at some point. We've always seen this, but for now it's not seeing that much play. And lastly, we have Cosmic Cyclone, which has really fallen off as well. I mean, again, something like Labyrinth can be good, especially like, you know, because they're playing a lot of furniture nowadays. Like, you know, like if you went first, like your opponent who's playing Labyrinth on your end phase, they may probably, you know, pitch your furniture and try to trap in your end phase, and you can, at least if you kept it in your hand, can get rid of that as well. Obviously, there's some risk to that as well. And of course, with Centurion now into the mix, this card can also be pretty good against them, just being able to get rid of their field spell, because that field spell is really, really strong. So there's some applications there, but right now at least I'm not seeing that much play with this card. Alright guys, so that was it for the tier list of the best hand traps and staples in this current format. Hopefully you found that interesting, and hopefully it helped you in terms of building out your deck list for your future events. Definitely a big thanks to all of you for watching the video. A huge thanks to my patrons as always for continued support, and well, take care guys.